Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Michael Paoliso, president of the Society for Applied Anthropology. As a visual introduction, I'm a white male, brown hair, aging, wearing a dark jacket and a light blue shirt. And I use the pronouns he and him. I want to welcome all of you to the Society for Applied Anthropology's annual award meeting. And I want to also welcome those who will be viewing this in Whova. We're recording this, so it will be posted to Whova if you've missed any of it, you want to review it. Before we hear from our three awardees tonight, I want to mention that in the last 24 hours, we completed the student poster competition. So we have 8 winners of student posters, combined 20-some students. 3 of those posters, student award posters, were on site, 3 were online, and we had 2 for the Valine Smith tourism poster. Those, the titles and the students' names and affiliations will be uploaded to Whova, and we'll also upload them to the SfAA annual meeting webpage. Are there any student poster awardees here in the room? Okay, I just wanted to double check. If so, we would love to recognize you. All right, spirited and impassioned debates on what anthropology has been, is, and should be has always been a strength of our discipline. And we practice it with passion and commitment with the goal of making a difference. Margaret Mead, Saul Tax, Bronislaw Malinowski, were anthropologists who made a difference in anthropology and beyond. Today, in bestowing awards in their names, we give recognition to 3 contemporary scholarship and practice that Mead, Tax, Malinowski would be passionately engaged with, even if they didn't agree with all of it. At this ceremony, we recognize 3 outstanding anthropologists whose work exemplify the wonderful breadth and application of anthropology. The Margaret Mead Award, initiated by the Society for Applied Anthropology in 1979 and awarded jointly with the American Anthropological Association since 1983, recognizes the tradition of bringing anthropology to bear on wider social and cultural issues. It is awarded to a younger scholar for a particular accomplishment, such as a book, film, monograph, or service, which interprets anthropological data and principles in ways that make them meaningful and accessible to the public. This year's recipient is Amber Reed. Saul Tax was an anthropologist who provided distinguished and innovative service to applied anthropology and to anthropological societies. The Saul Tax Distinguished Service Award is presented annually to a member of the SfAA in recognition of long-term and truly distinguished service to the society. This year's recipient is Brian Foster. The Bronislaw Malinowski Award is presented annually to an outstanding senior social scientist in recognition of efforts to understand and serve the need of the world's societies and whose career has been devoted to solving human problems using the concepts and tools of social science. Recipients can be academics or practitioners whose work has had significant and long-term impacts within anthropology and beyond. This year's recipient is Faye V. Harrison. I would like to thank my colleagues who serve on the Mead, Tax, and Malinowski committees for their successful efforts in identifying 3 very deserving anthropologists. Their service is very much appreciated during these particularly challenging times. I'm fortunate this afternoon to be joined by fellow anthropologists who will help me introduce the awardees. I will introduce Amber Reed, James McDonald will introduce Brian Foster, and Mark Schuler will introduce Faye Harrison. After their talk, we will present their individual awards. For her excellent and important book, Nostalgia After Apartheid, Disillusionment, Youth, and Democracy in South Africa, I'm very pleased to present the Margaret Mead Award to Dr. Amber Reed. Dr. Reed is an assistant professor of international studies at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a BA in anthropology from Barnard College in New York City. From 2014 to 2016, she was a postdoctoral fellow in anthropology and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been conducting ethnographic research in the rural Eastern Cape of South Africa since 2009 and has a particular interest in democratic education, historical memory, race, and the politics of culture. Published in 2020 by the University of Notre Dame Press, Nostalgia After Apartheid broadly focuses on the crisis of liberal representative democracy in South Africa and elsewhere. The book offers perspectives on the challenges of democracy and democratic education in rural South African communities. At the core of the book is a paradox, a nostalgia among Black youth in rural Eastern Cape for apartheid. Given the systemic racial violence of the apartheid regime, how does one explain this surprising longing among Black youth for this time? Nostalgia After Apartheid reveals the complexities that produce this cultural understanding of apartheid are linked to the failure of the post-apartheid democratic South Africa to realize its socially transformative promises. The committee found Nostalgia After Apartheid noteworthy and exemplary on multiple fronts. Ethnographically, Dr. Reed successfully immersed herself in the constellation of different settings and places that enabled her to see and to grasp the challenging and nuanced angles on South African society. Through ethnography, she shows how efforts to inculcate young people with the values of liberal democracy and citizenship clash with traditional cultural values and rigid hierarchies of age and gender. Importantly, she shows how efforts designed to develop democratic citizens may backfire if the broader context of young people's histories and cultures are ignored. The committee also spoke to the intellectual fearlessness that Dr. Reed brought to the ethnographic journey conveyed in the book. At the foundation of this ethnography is the troubling nostalgia for South Africa's apartheid era. And rather than sweep those details out of sight, Dr. Reed directly addresses them in this book. She helps us see the tenuousness and the uncertainties that pervade periods of dramatic social change and how Xhosa culture and values have endured the 20th century and beyond. As both the committee and the nominators noted, the relevance of Nostalgia After Apartheid extends far beyond the Eastern Cape of South Africa. The book's grounded understanding of the challenges of liberal democracy offers insights on other political situations where progressive agendas are flattened, remade, appropriated into regressive feelings of loss for a past when all was better, right, more ordered, and much that was wrong, oppressive, and unjust is culturally and politically sidelined. Nostalgia After Apartheid helped me better understand the extraordinary recent and ongoing political events here in the United States. Of great value, it gave me a sharper anthropological lens to make sense of the cultural construction of our past as great, something to be remade in the present, all the while misrepresenting, silencing, invalidating diverse future aspirations and our past problems, injustices, and true history. Nostalgia After Apartheid is an exemplary choice of an ethnographic monograph for the Margaret Mead Award. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Amber Reed.
Thank you so much. I first would love to thank the Society for Applied Anthropology and the American Anthropological Association for this truly incredible honor. I also want to take the time to thank my editor at Notre Dame, Eli Bortz, for his support from the beginning and seeing this project through their publication, as well as everyone else at Notre Dame. Thank you so much to my family for supporting me through a process that at times felt endless. And for those of you in the audience that are students, I want to let you know that this book involved plenty of rejections and heartache. These are realities in the academic process that I think we all too often don't make transparent to students and early career scholars. So I just want to make note of that here. Most of all, thank you to the people of Kumbu who so generously and bravely invited me into their lives and made this project possible. This award feels especially meaningful to me because, in part, of its namesake. Like me, I'm a graduate of Barnard College. In my senior year, I interned in the film festival that she started and now bears her name. I went on to work at the American Museum of Natural History for several years in education after that. And during my time there, her legacy was ever present. A particular thrill for me was someone taking me up the spiral staircase to see the room that was once her office and is now off limits to the public and inaccessible. A place that I learned she actually had a bed in because she slept there so often. The other reason this award is an especially incredible honor to me is because of what it exemplifies, quote, interpreting anthropological data and principles in ways that make them meaningful and accessible to a broadly concerned public. When I started graduate school at UCLA with Sandra Hale, I remember visiting her in her office and saying that I knew I didn't want to just write a book that sits on a shelf. While I wanted to make a contribution to the literature on democracy and the politics of memory in South Africa with this book, for me, the most important thing it offers is a way to better understand the continued presence of structural inequality in that country. So my sincere hope is that it offers a chance at honest representation for a community that has been historically marginalized and feels severely underrepresented on both national and international stages. To speak a little bit about the book, rural youth in South Africa's Eastern Cape province today officially have the rights and privileges that their grandparents and great-grandparents living under apartheid were denied. They have access to free public education, they can travel freely throughout the country, they can apply to attend any university, and they can pursue any career. When they turn 18, they can vote in elections. And yet, what I hope to illustrate in this book is how these legal rights have in many cases not translated to a better quality of life for many young people today. Instead, rural South Africans in the former homelands like the Transkei, where I did my fieldwork, continue to receive subpar education, suffer from structural poverty, and face chronic under and unemployment. What all this has meant for many people in the rural Eastern Cape is an emergent politics of memory that uses a nostalgic past to denigrate a massively disappointing present. As I describe in the book, when I first went to the Eastern Cape to conduct fieldwork, it was to learn about youth activism. I was interested in their investments in their own political futures. Instead, in interview after interview, young and old didn't want to talk to me about the future. They wanted to talk about the past. Again and again, I heard some version of, quote, life was just better during apartheid. At least we were able to practice our culture. Democracy has not brought freedom. These nostalgic discourses penetrate classrooms, which is where I did the majority of my fieldwork. South African students are learning about democracy in classes like life orientation, which is a mandated part of the national curriculum, and history from teachers who are ironically incredibly dissatisfied with their country's democratic transition, and who wax nostalgic for a deeply oppressive and anti-democratic past. While I importantly want to stress that this longing is most certainly not for the racist legislation of apartheid, it still nonetheless reflects on the spatial designs of apartheid, which forcibly relocated people to homelands based on ethnicity in the service of racial capitalism, disenfranchising them while relying on their highly undercompensated migrant labor. In places like the former Transkei, which were far from the interracial violence and striking inequality of cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, participants told me that they were able to grow up with, in their own words, without an awareness of their own oppression. They told me they felt, quote, free to practice their culture in a way they now feel is threatened by liberal democracy. They expected democracy to equal freedom, in particular, socioeconomic freedom, to have a much better quality of life, to have high-paying jobs, to have a better education. Instead, the rural Eastern Cape suffers from many of the same structural inequalities it did during apartheid, a serious lack of infrastructure in a country with incredible wealth, classrooms that frequently have 70 students and 1 teacher and not enough textbooks, unemployment rates that in this area have at times reached up to 70%. The changes that people recognize from democracy then are not economic liberation. Instead, they equate democracy with Western liberal values they often don't identify with: same-sex marriage, abortion, children's rights. Their nostalgia is more than a carefully constructed view of the past. It is a striking commentary on the present. In the book, I also explore the role of non-governmental organizations in supplementing youth education in rural South Africa. I investigate the impact of an organization called the Sanke Gender Justice Network and their programming in the Eastern Cape, where they ran a series of workshops on things like digital storytelling, peer education, and gender equality from 2008 to 2011. One of the things I work to highlight in the book is how NGOs like Sanke, even if they are in fact actually internal to South Africa, Sanke is a South African NGO, they still bring with them liberal democratic values frequently at odds with local teachings and don't represent community perspectives. In some cases, residents complained to me that the NGO staff that came into their community were insensitive to the kinds of cultural obstacles to changing gender roles that they faced. I have since presented this work to Sanke in their Cape Town offices in the hopes of contributing to a more equitable dialogue that allows local communities to speak back to NGOs that I think too often do not have the final say in such scenarios. On a broader level, the contribution I hope this book has made beyond just the case of South Africa is what it might tell us about nostalgia and politics more globally. Nostalgia politics are everywhere, in Make America Great Again campaigns, in Brexit's fantasy of British identity, in Putin's warped view of Russian unity. In all these cases, we should be thinking about how these discourses potentially bleed into educational spaces. How might children be learning through a politics of nostalgia? What kinds of intergenerational transmission of nostalgia might be occurring? This is certainly happening in rural South Africa, where many young people echo the nostalgic sentiments of their elders. I've had youth who weren't even alive during apartheid tell me that, quote, life was just better then. And we are also currently seeing its political significance in efforts here in the US, with legislation seeking to control the narrative of history in classrooms. These efforts seek to remove conversations around race, racism, and sexuality, and instead portray a nostalgic picture of America's past that in fact never existed. And this is exactly what nostalgia is, a story we tell ourselves about the past through the lens of the present. We need to take these discourses seriously because they will shape youth political identity and potentially impact their decisions at the ballot box one day. Thank you.
So it's very much my pleasure to present to Amber the Margaret Mead Award. It's a bronze plaque here that's been framed. It was developed by past President Will Sibley. And on it says Margaret Mead Award of Society of Applied Anthropology, American Anthropological Association to Amber Reed 2021. And also a framed certificate that mentions the book as well and the same information. So at this time, I'd like to ask Jim McDonald to come up and he'll introduce our next awardee, Brian Foster.
Thanks, Michael. Well, I'm a short white male with tortoise-rimmed glasses and recently retired, so that will give you some sense of my age. And it's a distinct honor to introduce Dr. Brian Foster as this year's most deserving recipient of the Sol Tax Distinguished Service Award. Brian has a long and distinguished career as a faculty member and university administrator. His research originally centered on the Mon River traders in Thailand, which on the surface looks like it fits squarely in the box of rural development studies. However, the corpus of work quickly climbs out of that box with its focus on ethnicity and entrepreneurship. Migrants from then Burma, the Mon moved into river trade in Thailand, something the Thai were not inclined to do. The Mon came to dominate that trade. A survey of the published literature reveals scant anthropological work on entrepreneurship, and Brian's work is arguably some of the earliest to be found on ethnic entrepreneurs. In other work, Brian examined household structure and their cycles among STEM families and the implications those have on household productivity and economic horsepower or its lack. Elsewhere, he undertook some very early quantitative modeling of social networks, along with mathematics colleague Steve Seidman. Then came his administrative career. Brian held 2 jobs as dean, one at Arizona State as dean of the graduate school, and another as dean of arts and sciences at Nebraska-Lincoln. And then came 2 provost positions, one at the University of New Mexico and the other at the University of Missouri. And I can tell you all of those jobs are incredibly big, complicated jobs. And Brian served in that capacity admirably. Further, Brian's cutting edge work has directly benefited the SfAA, where he has been the driving force of the anthropology of higher ed TIG. This started at the 2015 Pittsburgh meeting with a humble set of 10 paper presentations, which we were sure would be a one and done. Instead, this sparked tremendous latent interest that grew into a major part of subsequent conferences, averaging 30 sessions with over 100 individual contributions at each meeting, along with a total number of affiliates that tops 600. Much of this has been accomplished through Brian's tireless championing of diverse takes on higher ed through his vast network of contacts within and outside of anthropology. In their supporting nominating letter, Joe Donaldson and Steve Graham underscore Brian's achievement. As non-anthropologists, we are examples of how Brian has fostered the growth and awareness of the SfAA and in membership in the SfAA among a cadre of persons representing multiple disciplines who are interested in higher education and have benefited from being introduced to an applied anthropological perspective on the many challenges facing higher education. Thus far, this effort has produced 2 edited volumes, a guest edited issue of Practicing Anthropology, and many other journal articles. As a reviewer of one of these books, Navigating the Volatility of Higher Education, so aptly noted, this volume is not simply a summary of the changes underway and the impulses that foster them. Instead, this volume uses applied anthropology to explain these changes in higher education and suggest ways to manage them as they continue to unfold. In closing, I'd like to share an anecdote that speaks volumes about Brian. When I was a doctoral student way back in the day at Arizona State, Brian put together something called the Evening Dissertation Seminar that pulled together a group of us once a week to brainstorm, emote, explore ideas and non-ideas, and keep on going. Who does that after a long day as the dean of the graduate college, I ask you? In fact, who does that in general? From Patty, Maxine, Danuta, Kathy, Linda, Orit, and me, we all thank you deeply for your generosity and kindness in getting us to the finish line. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Brian Foster, this year's Soltex Distinguished Service Award recipient.
Thank you. Jim, thank you very, very much. And thank you, SfAA, for this wonderful award. I'm extremely honored to receive the Soltex Award for my support of SfAA and for my work in applied anthropology. work that's been really at the core purpose of my life for the last 40 years. Though I have to say I didn't quite realize it in that way until after I retired. More on that coming. My path to into academics was pretty unusual, but it had had me oriented toward practical perspective throughout my academic life. And I think a brief background on my life would be kind of interesting to put my applied anthropology experience into a context that might help understand just where applied anthropology is going. I was a non-traditional student in many ways, a first-generation student, went to undergraduate school in my late 20s. I worked in retail and owned a fire and casualty insurance agency for several years to support my family after my dad's business failed. I always wanted to go to college, though I didn't really quite understand what that was. But one day I decided to go take a night course at Northern Illinois University, which was the only school close to where I lived. And I met this fabulous person in the admissions office, and I talked to him for 2 hours and left a full-time student while I still had my business. And my first course that I signed up for was anthropology, which seemed really interesting, partly because I didn't know what it was. After commuting 40 miles a day, every day for a year and a half, I finally sold my business and I moved to an awful basement apartment in DeKalb, at where Northern Illinois is, and worked 48 hours a week as a night clerk in a hotel throughout my undergraduate. And I graduated in 4 years, however, and with a very high GPA. And perhaps maybe the best measure of how naive I was about higher education was that 2 of my mentors nominated me for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and I didn't know what a fellowship was. But somehow I ended up getting the fellowship, and I did my PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan. My dissertation focused on traders in Thailand, as Jim mentioned, a topic very fit with my background in business, of course. The traders were descendants of migrants from Burma, again, as Jim had said, and that became my lifelong or my career-long interest in minority traders and in more generally ethnic differences and identity manipulation and social networks. But anyway, after graduation, I taught anthropology for 10 years at 2 institutions, and then I drifted into administration. It happened accidentally. I had no aspiration to become an administrator, but I was department chair and graduate dean at Arizona State, dean of arts and science at Nebraska-Lincoln, as Jim had said, and provost at University of Missouri and at University of New Mexico first, and then University of Missouri. From the day I started as an administrator, I was a very anthropological administrator. And I was not a micromanager, but I was sort of at the 50,000 foot level. My focus was on how to take all the many parts of the institution and bring them together to make a coherent university. With close attention to the complex cultural environment of higher education, which is built on, of course, centuries of sacred traditions. I was also very interested in the issues of higher education identity differences, not just ethnic or racial, but differences in the disciplines, in donors with conflicting interests, in faculty versus administration, the academic versus the business side of the institution, connections with community and political dynamics and much more. It's not an exaggeration to say that my administrative career of 30 years was a career in applied anthropology. It was my anthropological mindset, I would call it a mindset, that drove most of my priorities and my decisions as an administrator. Ironically, though I was practicing anthropology, I almost totally lost contact with the anthropology departments at the institutions that after I left the department chair position, which was a very purposeful decision to avoid the appearance of bias in supporting, in quotes, my department. But this is a very important thing. I lost contact with the Department of Anthropology, but I was practicing anthropology, okay? I did many presentations while I was administrator, often in the form of scholarly papers at national higher educational associations, such as the Council of Graduate Schools, the ACE, and many, many others. And I served on boards and academic committees of many such organizations. And my point here is that although I was not doing research for anthropological organizations, I was doing applied anthropological research for organizations with significant political, policy, and operational influence on higher education. And that's what applied anthropology is really all about, I think. My connection to anthropology organizations was most strong to SfAA. Some of my major projects that I promoted as an administrator reflect this kind of anthropological focus. Priorities included, for instance, interdisciplinary research and teaching, strong community engagement, international and multilingual programs, active learning, all linked to my anthropological way of thinking about my job. Most important, in all of my administrative positions, I opposed the competitive and often ranked status of different education sectors. For instance, research universities, regional schools, liberal arts colleges, community colleges, trade schools, and so on. Bottom line, some of the so-called higher level institutions denigrate the so-called lower status institutions in politics and in recruitment of students and faculty and in fundraising and a lot more. And sadly, this prestige is often defined in terms of quality that is defined as restrictiveness in admissions and all kinds of other things, hiring and other kinds of things. As a result, it's virtually, and this is my point here, it's virtually impossible to make a coherent case for higher education as a whole. My purpose was to promote the idea that different sectors of higher education had complementary missions that together served our society and laid the foundation for us to make a coherent political case for the broader world of higher education, something we cannot do now to make a coherent case for higher education. So at age 75, several things came together and drive my decision to retire my provost position in Missouri. One critical one was age, of course, and my wife had very advanced Parkinson's and needed a lot of care. But in addition, there were changes at the university leadership that were making me a little bit uncertain that I continue to be a good fit. So I really didn't have a plan, but it was at this point that I returned to what I would call the academic side of applied anthropology. I thought it would be interesting to put together a couple of sessions at the SfAA meeting in 2015 that would give an anthropological perspective on the chaos in higher education. And so there were, as Jim said, 2 sessions in the 2015 meeting, plus actually an overall discussion session, and they got a whole lot more interest than anyone would have expected. Many people encouraged me then to go ahead and organize sessions for 2016 and maybe explore setting up a TIG, which would provide continuity for anthropology of higher ed. We did establish the TIG, as Jim said, and within a very short time, we had several hundred affiliates or members, an outcome no one would have predicted. The TIG now has a fairly formal structure and has given about 100 presentations at each of the last meetings, again, as Jim has pointed out. Based on these presentations, we've published 2 books, 2 edited books and special issue of Practicing Anthropology, and a lot of other publications are coming. The group's extremely interdisciplinary, which I consider to be a very positive thing. All of this, as all of this evolved, our purpose for the anthropology of higher education really got defined, namely to take a holistic approach to the volatility of higher education. It is a very complex environment, higher education is, and there are a lot of constituencies with conflicting interests, a lot of political influence, a lot of challenging political fiscal issues, some brutal competition within higher ed. All of these things are really, really complicated, but most important, they all interact with one another. They all ripple through one another, okay? And the most important part about this holistic approach that the anthropology of higher education brings, and an applied anthropological approach, is that it is a way to deal with the way all of these different issues ripple through one another, this holistic approach. I mean, most of the research on higher education looks at one piece of it. It looks at student success or research productivity or something like that. But none of these things make a whole lot of sense if you don't see how all of the other things ripple through them. You got to look at it all. So this holistic approach that we're suggesting in the anthropological study of higher education is a way to address the complexity in the volatility and chaos in higher education. So after 30 years as an anthropological administrator, I returned to the more academic applied anthropology research on the issues that I had anthropologically administered. It was the link to SfAA that made all of this work. It provided a perfect venue for developing a sustained research agenda examining higher education, one of the most complex and most important issues facing our country today. There is a broad agreement that education is central to quality of life in our society, but there is little agreement on how to address the conflicting demands of the constituents and the political interventions and all of those things. And I think our TIG has made significant progress in bringing applied anthropology into the issue in a way that could potentially influence policy, politics, educational operations at all levels, and bring the education system together to form a coherent asset for our society. Again, I'm extremely grateful to receive this award. I'm grateful for all of the support that I've had from my colleagues, and thank you all.
Recipients of our SALT Tax Award receive a nice frame certificate here, as well as a beautiful rocking chair over here on the right. It's a very coveted rocking chair. I know a couple recipients have tested it out at their place. We can't test it out here because it's just loosely put together because we still have to ship it. But there's a mandate that goes with this chair that you can rest and relax in it, but you also need to keep thinking about service and applied anthropology. Okay, yeah, okay. Is Mark Schuler here? There he is. Thanks. So Mark Schuler will introduce our Malinowski recipient.
So it is not just an honor, but one of the biggest honors of my life to be introducing the winner of this year's Malinowski Award, Faye Venetia Harrison. The Bonisa Malinowski Award is presented to an outstanding social scientist in recognition of efforts to understand and serve the needs of the world's societies and who has actively pursued the goal of solving human problems using the concepts and tools of social science during one's entire career. My own introduction to Faye's work is as an undergrad, reading her 91 volume, she co-edited Decolonizing Anthropology. It was and continues to be a touchstone and inspiration for me and many, many others. Decolonizing Anthropology arose out of a conversation at the other anthropology meetings 35 years ago. It remains urgent and timely as ever. And like the Jane parable, this is only seeing one part of the elephant. There is so much more to Faye's legacy. To keep this under 10 minutes was a very happy challenge. Harrison, past president of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, has focused much of her life and career on the African diaspora, the politics and political economy of social inequality, and gendered anti-racism as site for human rights discourse and practice. She is currently professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at the University of Illinois and Urbana-Champaign. She has worked at several universities in the US and been a visiting scholar in South Africa, Suriname, and Japan. In 2020, she was part of an online course, The Theory and Politics of the African Diaspora in the Americas, which the Black Brazilian Women's Civil Society Organization, Criolla, hosted. Last year, she facilitated a seminar at Central European University's online summer course, New Frontiers in Romani Studies, Insights from Critical Race Theory. Her seminar examined the difference anthropologists make in interdisciplinary conversations and problem-solving projects on the issues for which critical race theorists are known and too often misunderstood. Harrison's perspective on the mutual relationship between theory and engaged practice, or praxis, is found in many of her publications, including Resisting Racism and Xenophobia, Global Perspectives on Race, Gender, and Human Rights, published in 2005, Outsider Within, Reworking Anthropology in the Global Age, 2008, and articles and essays such as What Does Transformation Mean, in 2011, Dismantling Anthropology's Domestic and International Peripheries, 2012, Theorizing Eccentric Sites in 2016, and Refusing the God Trick, Engaging Black Women's Knowledge in 2022. She has been the recipient of honors and awards such as the Southern Anthropological Society's Zora Neale Hurston Award for Mentoring, Service, and Scholarship in 2007, the Association of Black Anthropologists Legacy Scholar Award 2010, and the American Anthropological Association Presidential Award in 2007 and 2018. She just delivered the distinguished lecture, Reckoning with Dread, Dilemmas of Democracy When All Lives Don't Matter, at the last SfAA meeting. Her impact on the discipline and critical praxis spans generation and truly the globe. The genuine love she has for anthropology, her work, her students, and social justice are easily evident in the letters of nomination and support for this award. I wanted to share a few snippets of this love with you all. So I'm quoting here. We can think of no one who better exemplifies all aspects of the award. Professor Harrison has directed her entire career towards the solving of world problems, and in so doing has practiced in anthropology without borders, an anthropology that honors the wisdom and scholarship of anthropologists around the world. She thus requires that their voices be heard. She is dedicated to an inclusive anthropology, the only anthropology she believes in, and that her record of scholarship and service demonstrates can effectively contribute to solving the global problems the world faces. Professor Harrison's lifelong scholarship and service makes her richly deserving of the Malinowski Award. As president of the Association for Black Anthropologists in 1987, she convened a foundational conversation that was to lead to one of the most influential texts in anthropology, published in 3 editions. Decolonizing Anthropology opened up spaces for dialogue and changed the course of anthropological theory and practice, influencing a generation of scholars. She followed this with a collection of her own essays, offering an intersectional, global Black feminist analysis to world problems and to anthropology and beyond, 2008, Outsider Within. Dr. Harrison's decades of work continue to support inclusion in the field, helping marginalized groups build their own careers in the field. This is evidenced by her work as one of the early leaders of the ABA. She co-edited a 1999 book, Rewriting the Contributions of Black Anthropologists into the History of Anthropology, African American Pioneers. Harrison has mentored dozens of scholars, particularly women and particularly people of color, into successful careers in anthropology, many of whom are here today going to be shouting out when she is going to stand up. These applied social scientists are working with the communities all over the world to solve real-world problems. Dr. Harrison's leadership in opening spaces for the application of social science and supporting scholar activists of color crosses national boundaries. She was invited to attend the historic United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, WCAR, in Durban, South Africa in 2001, just days before 9/11. Fulfilling her career-long commitment to decolonizing anthropology, Harrison played a leadership role in the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, chairing the Commission on Anthropology of Women for 16 years. From 1993 to 2009, she led a workshop at the 1995 UN Conference of Women in China. Following being a board member at large, Harrison became its president from 2013 to 2018. In this role, Harrison facilitated exchange and dialogue, raising the profile of the IUAES and supporting anthropologists in less powerful and marginalized countries. And her comments today at the Pelt Award are a testament to that. Harrison is a critical anthropologist like few others, a scholar who uses ethnography, social theory, and archival historical research to understand and serve the needs of the world's societies while simultaneously challenging hegemonic configurations of our discipline from an Africana studies perspective. She frames her scholarly interventions in robustly interdisciplinary ways, providing close readings of specific locales in the US and abroad, while convincingly situating these same readings within larger theoretical and geopolitical contexts. Faye Harrison's lasting contribution rests on her ongoing description and theorization of complex forms of bias and colonial thinking that she has tried to counter with her call for more decolonized forms of ethnographic practice. This is a project rigorously grounded in exhaustive and holistic archival research on work produced by African Americans and other minoritarian anthropologists who are excluded from the anthropological canon. Her scholarship challenges prevailing assumptions about the nature of ethnographic research in the context of racialized discourse and institutionalized oppression, reminding readers that contemporary anthropologists of color and others must find ways to carve out a modicum of agency and autonomy in spite of virulently racist assumptions about their lack of scientific objectivity and analytical dexterity. Faye Harrison's contributions to the field do not rest in the domain of scholarship, however important this has been. Her leadership within the SfAA and the IUAES has given her platforms to pursue the goal of solving world problems with the tools of engaged social science, has shaped the terms in which American anthropologists engage with an international anthropological or social scientific community. I'm quoting here, having worked with a number of her students, I can attest to the depth of the mentorship they have enjoyed. As a graduate student, I look to Faye as a model for how a creatively inclined Black woman could do anthropology and make a difference in the world. And I still do. Her analyses always combine a critical analysis of intractable social problems with the lived experience of ordinary persons. This leads to empowering the voices of those we study and advocating for change. For more than 3 decades, she has conducted an ongoing research and analysis as a political anthropologist interested in culture, politics, and political economy as they relate to inequality. Her research continues to widen and deepen our understanding of power relationships on a national and transnational level through the lenses of race, class, gender, and the transnational process itself. She was a scholar of the concept of intersectionality before it became popular in anthropology. Dr. Harrison has been an important force in transforming anthropology, in decolonizing the discipline and bringing the analysis of race and racism to the fore, thus helping anthropologists to be more attentive to the needs of the communities we study and to work towards understanding and solving some of the world's most intractable problems that we face. Faye has inspired, encouraged, mentored, and in many real ways created the next generation of scholars and practitioners who are also challenging the discipline of anthropology to be more than what it is, from within as well as without. Please join me in congratulating Faye Venetia Harrison in this richly deserved award.
What can I say after all that? Is there a point to give my talk? Are we in my title slide here? Good, good. It's a great honor to receive this award. I'm truly indebted to the several colleagues who nominated me for this distinction. I also thank the Malinowski Award Committee and the Board of Directors for selecting me from what I know was an extremely rich pool of highly qualified candidates. My understanding of what applied anthropology is, what it encompasses, what his possibilities are, has been influenced by my former teachers, mentors, and many engaged scholars from the history of the field who have set important precedents that later generations and cohorts of applied social scientists have built upon. I've also learned a great deal from networks of peers, some of whom were my students. They continue to stimulate my thinking and challenge me to rethink in ways I would not be able to accomplish alone. I'm privileged to have 3 of my former professors among the distinguished scholars who've received Malinowski Awards. Sinclair Drake, full name John Gibbs, but no one called him that, who received the award in 1990. Clifford Barnett in 2012, and Louise Lanphier in 2017. These individuals had a profound impact on my formation as an anthropologist and social scientist. Since so much of our education and training takes place beyond the formal curriculum and continues throughout our lives, I'd also like to acknowledge another awardee, Beatrice or B. Medicine, who received the award in 1996. She was a senior colleague who informally taught me a great deal and gave me the gift of friendship. She brought anthropology's tools and perspectives to bear on problem solving in the arenas of indigenous alcohol and drug treatment, community health and mental health, gender cognizant multicultural education, language policy, criminal justice and law enforcement, religious revitalization and tolerance, and the organizational development of women's empowerment. Her work and his legacy teach us important lessons about recapturing, decolonizing, and transforming anthropology. Her perspective as a Lakota intellectual and activist enrich anthropological praxis in ways we're only beginning to understand and appreciate. With my thanks for her impact, her conviviality, and what she means to so many of us, I remember her as I characterized her in Medicine Woman, a poem, and I'm not even a poet, a poem I recited as part of my introduction to her at the awards ceremony in 1996. To set the tone for my address, I'd like to read the following excerpt. Medicine Woman. Teacher, counselor, poet, anthropologist, neighbor, kinswoman, sacred pipe woman of the Sundance. We esteem and honor you and recognize the struggles and quests that have led you down the path you have walked and continue to walk. You do not travel alone. Teacher, sacred pipe woman of the sun dance. We sing our praises before the light of the moon and sun, which illuminate empowering possibilities for remaking the world. Louise Lanphier is responsible for my decision to pursue advanced studies and then a career in anthropology. I encountered her and her exemplary feminist engagement while an undergraduate student at Brown University. She helped me believe that I too could become an anthropologist when I grew up. And that doesn't always happen to students of color, no matter what school they go to. Since those many years ago, she has continued to demonstrate her interest in me as a person, in my career, with a feminist ethic of care that is too infrequently exhibited with such consistency and conviction. Tell the truth, sister. Over the years, I've seen how she does more than talk the talk, which is so much easier than it is to walk the walk. Her leadership in anthropology and resuscitating our historical memory of women who were marginalized despite their tremendous contributions to the discipline. In breaking the ground to make way for more diverse students and scholars, particularly women, to get through the gates and past academic gatekeepers. All of that has been phenomenal. As her 2017 plenary address highlighted, women and feminists have played an important part in innovating ethnographic research and engaged scholarship by engendering modes of multivocal, critically reflexive, and collaborative activist inquiry that aim to change policy and, I think more importantly, to make interventions and disruptions that interrupt established logics whose effects have been to reproduce social inequities and injustices. What women think and do makes a difference and drives us in new directions. Louise clarified the convergence of applied practicing and public interest approaches to anthropology. Her call to appreciate these convergences was followed, call and response. It was followed by a response in which Setha Lowe and Sally Ingle-Mary address the diverse forms and dilemmas of anthropology's public engagements, which include teaching, social criticism, collaboration, advocacy, and activism. These three feminist colleagues have helped to provide firmer operational grounding for key terms that are too often appropriated and denuded of what they can potentially mean as heuristics, tools that can help us create conditions for new fertile ground whose successful navigation point us in the right direction for more potent forms of praxis. I'm referring to the kind of symbiotic, mutually constitutive relationship between theory and practice that needs more than the conjunction and, especially when it can be replaced by the preposition versus, which denotes a dichotomous and rank-ordered relationship, theory, practice. Theory and practice are inextricably interrelated aspects of socially situated and negotiated knowledge, production, and application. This approach demands a shift from the valorization of discourse that's elitist, inaccessible, alienating, an approach as though it's disembodied, to a concern with theorizing as a modality of practice in itself, a form of critically creative and creatively critical work performed in diverse dialogic and relational contexts. To those of us for whom theorizing is a tool and a tactic for struggle against imperial forms of globalization, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, poverty, gender and sexual oppressions, environmental injustices, militarism, and the merciless negation of human rights and dignity, the crafting of intelligible, convincing, interpretive, and explanatory frames is imperative if we want to do more than simply talk to ourselves in the ivory tower. Can we situate ourselves or resituate ourselves in wider circles of conversation, constructive criticism, and fugitive planning about praxis-based research projects that can inspire the re-envisioning of an alternative world and the world making that leads us there? Can we reimagine forms of cooperative and sometimes collaborative praxis that ignite the desire and courage for mobilizing and building organizational capacity for change, particularly of the abolitionist and revolutionary kind, if we're truly so inclined? Quite a few of the individuals I'll mention this afternoon are praxis-oriented, understanding that a reconceptualization, reworking, and application of theory are integral to the practical art and science of problem solving. My second, can I have my water at the bottom? My second professor to become a Malinowski recipient, and here you can go back to Dangerous Cliff. Thank you so much. Here you have the image, one back, I guess another one. Where's Cliff Barnett? Before, all right, keep it there. So Cliff Barnett, I took one course with him at Stanford, and it was my first trimester. It was a course on applied anthropology, my introduction, and it was a core course. But I understand there had been intense debate among the faculty about whether that course deserved that designation. Theory, practice. Stanford was known as the Harvard of the West, and it prided in itself in the conceptual and theoretical sophistication of its faculty, students who were being trained for the professoriate. Maybe some of you have different recollections or experiences, but this is mine. And I thought about it for how many years? 40. So even though there were engaged and applied anthropologists on the faculty, applied anthropology per se was not a priority. So this is the context in which I entered graduate school and experienced my first trimester. I took applied anthropology much as a rite of induction. I realize this now, looking back. That course helped me think about the question that Haitian anthropologist Anselme Remy raised in an anti-racist, anti-imperialist article he titled Anthropology for Whom and What? I knew that I didn't want my anthropology to be solely for knowledge's sake. I was convinced that anthropology could offer a toolkit for bettering the world. So let me say that I had an extremely affirming formative experience at Stanford University. I benefited from working with nearly all the professors with whom I studied, nearly. But without a doubt, the professor who influenced me most was Dr. Drake. And because of age and whatever, I would never call him St. Clair, which was the custom in the department. Everyone's on a first name basis. We're all equal, level playing field, or the fallacy. But for my culture, someone who's an elder is always has a title. It's not auntie or uncle. I'm from the South. It's Mr. or sometimes it's a kin term. But in this case, this was Dr. Drake. And then Drake. That was the most informal we would get. All right, but without a doubt, he was most influential. And over the years, I've come to realize how much. From him, in the countless griot sessions in his office and the conversations when we walked our bikes to the library or towards home off campus, I learned about the politics, history, and sociology of anthropology and the silencing of those aspects of the disciplinary past that involve the intellectual agency of Africans and African descendants in various diaspora locations. Those intellectual and epistemological agents in our discipline's history have been objectified and nativized in the ethnographic record. I also learned about Black and other subaltern struggles for freedom, justice, and self-determination throughout the world. Drake's research in Natchez, Mississippi, Chicago, Illinois, Cardiff, Wales, London, England, and Prague, Ghana gave me generative insights that helped prepare me for becoming an urban anthropologist interested in the politics and political economy of urbanization, poverty, and underdevelopment. Drake also helped me understand the structural formation and dynamics of race and power, and that racism includes, but is much, much more than the prejudice of a few or even a whole barrel of bad apples. His experience in race relations took shape while he was still a graduate student at Chicago. During that time, his mentor, Allison Davis, he and his mentor, Allison Davis, both contributed research memoranda to the 1997 Malinowski recipient Gunnar Myrdal's commissioned An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy, published in 1944. This study relied on the scholarly expertise of a number of African-American social scientists who were relegated to the shadows of mainstream intellectual life in this country. Just the next year, still a graduate student at the University of Chicago, Drake and his co-author, sociologist Horace Caton, published Black Metropolis, a 2-volume book based on Depression-era WPA research, which became an award-winning classic in sociology, not in anthropology. It has taken some of us 40, 50 years of a campaign to convince anthropologists that that classic contribution was just as much a it is just as much urban anthropology as it is a sociological treatise. And in that case, graduate student St. Clair Drake was actually the lead author of that book. Now, I can't imagine as a graduate student producing anything of that quality. So this tells us about the caliber the breadth of knowledge, the erudition, the encyclopedic scope of our 1990 recipient, who, because he was basically on his deathbed, was not able to go to York, UK, to give his address to thank the SfAA for that prestigious award. Drake was a scholar activist, and that's the term that's used in Africana and Pan-African studies in the Black radical tradition, which is a transnational trajectory grounded in struggles to liberate the Africana world from colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism, and if he were alive today, I'm pretty sure he would add racial capitalism. The latter was concerned that Stanford alumnus and political scientist Cedric Robinson, who had been an anthro major as an undergraduate at Berkeley, addressed in his Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, published in 1983. In Cedric's acknowledgements, he wrote, and I quote, "Among the number of scholars to whom an intellectual acknowledgement is owed, I must distinguish St. Clair Drake. Both his patience and example are reflected in the body of his work. He carries his knowledge with wisdom and grace. Drake's neo-Marxist Pan-Africanism brought the history of race and racism into conversation with the history of capitalism, European colonial expansion, and modernity. The influences that shaped his approach came from W.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, C.L.R. James, and later in his life, Walter Rodney. This aspect of his oeuvre has made a deep impression on my work, which has included an examination of the interlocking racial, class, and gendered logics of the neoliberal restructuring of global capitalism and the structural violence it inflicts. I've been particularly concerned with how inextricable entanglements of gender and race as salient axes of inequality and power affect the continuum of agentive practices that include what Drake called coping, accommodation, resistance, and in the key words widely used today, fugitivity and refusal. I'm following cases of racism and anti-racism, especially gendered forms, in which the continuum of violence, including intimate partner violence, political violence, and epistemic violence against Black women in the United States South and in the global South, in settings such as Cuba, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. How this continuum of struggle has put on social political agendas health compromising and life-threatening problems to be addressed, redressed, and repaired in multi-scalar contexts that demand extra local and transnational networks of cooperation and solidarity. I'm gendering the culture and political economy questions that his influence helped me formulate. And I'm weaving a racial economy perspective into the feminist analysis that Louise Lanford and Michelle Rosaldo, along with a host of others dating back to the 19th century abolitionist activists and public intellectuals like Mariah Stewart and Anna Julia Cooper, helped contemporary feminists, intersectional feminists, help to inspire our work. Drake received the Malinowski, as I said, only a couple months before his death in June 1990. I can only imagine what he might have said in light of his remarkable track record of anthropological practice in the United States, United Kingdom, and West Africa. But I felt it was important to fill the gap that must exist in many of your memories or knowledge, because this is an extraordinary scholar who, in a sense, was on the margins of our discipline. Lord Warner was a major influence on Drake, as Tom Weaver says in his edited collection of Malinowski papers. But it was really Allison Davis who was the most immediate influence. And contrary to what Weaver said, he says that Drake was one of two recipients who had actually worked with Malinowski. That's not true. It was Drake's mentor, Allison Davis, who had been a student of Malinowski at LSE during the year or so that he was on leave from Harvard. So there was that Malinowski influence, I would say, at least indirectly, because Davis had that transnational educational experience and training. But Malinowski also came into contact with and taught and influenced other African-American anthropologists that most of us don't know about, such as Eslanda Cardosa Good Robinson, an advocate and activist in the struggle against American racism and colonial domination in Africa. Davis, Robeson, Jomo Kenyatta, and K.K. Matthews, a South African lawyer who taught social anthropology and native law at Fort Hare University, they appropriated the methodological and analytical tools they learned from Malinowski while debating other aspects of his thinking, which reflected his Eurocentric and white supremacist bias. I mean, he was a nice guy, but he was a product of his time and world. Robeson wrote about her debt to Malinowski and her ambivalent experiences with him in her 1945 African Journey, a blurred genre text that is diary, ethnography, and travelogue. That book has been applauded for the decolonized manner in which it represented Africans and African life. So this year's awardee, and I felt unlikely awardee when I got the letter. I had to pinch myself. I feel truly humbled, yet when I think about the history of this award, I feel pretty much at home joining the list of Malinowski recipients. Because it includes individuals who've helped make it possible for me to stand before you today. Moreover, as an African diaspora specialist and as a scholar who's invested a great deal of time writing, teaching, and doing service work around race, racism, and anti-racism, I'm heartened to see that well before Drake's 1990 award, there were earlier recipients who had interrogated and worked toward the redress of racism. The very first recipient, Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, in 1973. He was known mainly for his work on behalf of indigenous communities in Mexico, but he also addressed Afro-Mexicanos in Veracruz, in La Costa Chica. Also, Juan Gomez worked both at home in Mexico and transnationally to combat racism. And as I've already pointed out, one of the two 1974 Nobel laureates for economic sciences, Sweden's Gunnar Myrdal, who received the award in 75, our award in 75, ended up addressing, after being commissioned to study the Negro problem, he ended up addressing the white problem, which was the crux of the matter in undermining the development of substantive democracy in our society. But there's another Malinowski Award connection that I find intriguing and which resonates with another aspect of my interest in the history of US anthropology. The 1984 recipient of our award, Alexander H. Leighton, during his tenure at Cornell, supervised the dissertation research of Monet Helen Fowler. In 1952, she became the first African-American woman to receive a PhD in anthropology in these United States. In analyzing the 1950 service workers' strike at Cornell, particularly the new Black leadership that unexpectedly emerged in the union, she synthesized elements from Leighton's and William Foote White's competing theoretical frameworks. So this Leighton connection was someone that I knew, and I've been doing an intellectual biography of, actually, I think it was since the 90s, and I'm about to publish a fuller chapter on her life as an applied anthropologist in the second and expanded edition of African-American Pioneers in Anthropology. So very quickly, I want to say about Fowler, because most people never heard of her, even if you went to Cornell or before that, she was at Columbia, but left because she was committed to practical science. She's very versatile. If you read her 2-volume dissertation, you could see this person has a sophisticated handle of theory. And she built her anew, what I would call a creolized framework, drawing on elements from her professors who were rivals theoretically and probably in other ways as well. All right, so for her, theory was very important, but she was committed to practical science. I mean, she didn't dream about getting a tenure-track job in the Ivy League. Years later, as director in the department or the School of Social Work at Syracuse, director of a family service center, she did research in which basically she trained and facilitated community. She shifted the intellectual locus of power and authority from the university to basically community. And basically she got fired for that because in the late 60s and early 70s, there was no receptive audience in many universities for PAR types of work, or work that challenged the dominant power dynamics of research. But what was interesting is even after they fired her, I understand that the community refused to just supply mere informants to the university social work faculty and students, because they had developed a sense of themselves as a collective intellectual subject. Hey. Besides this biography of Monet Fowler, which I'm excited to get out soon, I'm also working on a biography, or at least an anthro-centered biography of Islanda Robeson. I'm excited about getting this stuff out after working or sitting on it for so long. And I want to make sure that you and other people are able to read this work and teach it And when writing, you can cite Black women. So if you don't know, Cite Black Women is a campaign, and some people even describe it as a movement that activist anthropologist Christian Smith initiated to offset the marginalization and erasure of Black women that has happened and continues to happen because of the racialized gendered biases of citational practices. Smith is part of a group of Afro-Brazilianists, next slide, please, who are unburying and translating the ideas of the late social anthropologist, feminist, and Black movement activist Leila Gonzalez, so that more of us will be aware that Black feminism and feminist activist anthropology were not invented in the United States. Like Fowler, Gonzalez's scholar activism was exemplary praxis, especially in the context of Latin America, or what she mapped as América Latina, to underscore the presence and the impact of Africans and Afro-descendants in Abya Yala. She, along with a number of other activist intellectuals, helped to forge the path towards new forms of autonomous decolonial feminisms being practiced today in collectives to which scholar activists such as Oche Curiel and Ruth Lozano Lerma belong. These are Colombia-based organizations that combine collaborative knowledge, collaborative leadership, and collaborative social action. Curiel is an Afro-Dominicana, queer feminist and social anthropologist who subscribes to decolonial politics of delinking from neoliberal logics, practices, and policies that capture citizenship, domesticate human rights, and impose a destructive strategy of development that undermines economic and ecological well-being and justice. She, one of my colleagues here, will be very happy to know this, she is also a performing artist, a singer, a recording artist who integrates the arts in her community organizing, popular education, and strategies for transnational solidarity. And she has a university gig, but that's not at the center of her life. Lozano is also a decolonial, and if you could see, one word, mujer negra, one word, speaking to what some European and other feminists call gender race, one word, because we're talking about that naughty entanglement where you cannot treat them, you can't talk about race and gender or race versus gender. And their methodological and theoretical and practical implications to that approach. But Lozano belongs to this collective that I'm becoming acquainted with. It's called Colectivo Otras Negras y Feministas, collaborating with indigenous women and mestiza women, along with accomplices from other parts of the world, including Guinea-Bissau and the US. This collective organized the International Forum on Feminicide, not femicide, different implications, in ethnic racialized groups in 2016. Otras Negras co-organized this feminist forum on the relationship between the racialized assassinations of women and global accumulation. The Pacific port city of Buenaventura is the capital of the disproportionate killings of Black people, particularly Black women, from lethal toxic masculinity in domestic and intimate life 2 political assassinations of women who express dissent, speak truth to power, and organize to vindicate the negated humanity of entire pueblos and communities. The city is also the hub for a revitalized trade bloc with Mexico, Peru, and Chile that promotes regional integration and cross-Pacific trade. This massive $3 trillion development is based on a geography, a necro-biopolitics, and the political economy of, and political ecology of racial terror, anti-Blackness, and death. Jaime Amparo Alves and Tata Gathrin Ravindran, 2 activist anthropologists, provide a very nuanced, poignant analysis of this dystopic place and how Afro-Colombians have been relegated to zones of non-being. Now, listen to this, otras negras, however, and their networks of compañeras have co-produced the beginnings of a critical analysis that places Black and Indigenous women at the center of urban, regional, and global accumulation. They offer a gendered perspective on horrific structural ramifications of feminicide in racial capitalism, while refusing to succumb to non-being and death. Indeed, they open themselves up to collectively experiencing rage, grief, and some measure of pleasure, of joy, through the solidarities they build as they talk and walk together, and invite others to walk among them as prospective agents of change. They aspire, the very last slide, please, to change the world by abolishing the matrices of oppression that contribute to dispossession, expropriation, displacement, and disposability, by vindicating their negated humanity, and by practicing forms of resistance that lead to, and they emphasize this notion, re-existence. In their collaborative pursuits, they seek to implement the indigenous and African principles of buen vivir and Ubuntu. I'm convinced that it makes a difference when Black and Indigenous women's voices, experiences, and knowledges are at the center of these sorts of conversations and these coalitions of struggle in which applied anthropologists might potentially be included as accomplices, who assume or accept the kinds of risks, vulnerabilities, shared responsibilities, and mutual obligations that most so-called allies traditionally have not. The intersectional feminists who inspire me most are Black and Indigenous women in social movement and civil society organizations, and also in decentered academic spaces that have been opened up to counter publics. These cis and trans women do much more than talk the talk. We need to figure out how to walk the walk towards horizons of new possibilities. We need to figure out how to walk among those struggling for sustainable life worlds of re-existence when so many lives depend on not having to travel alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye, for such an excellent presentation and for all your work. It's my privilege on behalf of the Society for Applied Anthropology to present you with this medallion designed by Hopi Silversmiths. Your great name on the back and the year. I don't know if I can put this over. Is that okay? Or you can? Yes. Certificate for you. I'm sure you have quite a few of these on your wall. Thank you. Now that you're warmed up with clapping and applauding, I'd like you to recognize and again congratulate all three of our awardees. Get a picture, amazing, inspiring, important work. Each one of them collectively, just awesome. I want to again thank Jim and Mark for helping with the introductions. I want to thank all of you for coming and participating in our award ceremony. I hope our awardees will stay around a little bit after so you could come and chat with them, look at their awards. Do not sit in the rocking chair, please. It might be interesting. And also after this, we have a reception to follow. So thank you for coming. And again, congratulations, everyone.